There is a knock coming. Not tonight, maybe not this week, but it is coming. And when it arrives, it will sound so ordinary that you will almost certainly answer it without thinking twice. That is the whole plan, because the most dangerous thing that has ever approached the human soul has never once announced itself as dangerous. It has always knocked politely. It has always worn the face of something reasonable, something small, something you could justify to yourself in half a second. And by the time most people realize what they let in, it is already sitting at their table, eating their food and rearranging their furniture as if it owns the place. So before you watch one more second of this video, ask yourself honestly, when something knocks on the door of your heart, do you actually know how to tell the difference between a guest and an intruder? Because if you do not, you are going to answer wrong. And you are going to answer wrong smiling, thinking you did the right thing. Stay with me to the end, because the way this story turns is not what you expect. And the final knock in this video is the one that matters most of all. C.S. Lewis spent much of his life thinking carefully about the ways that evil actually operates in a human life. And one of the conclusions he kept returning to, in different forms and different books, was this: the enemy of your soul rarely bothers using force. Force is loud. Force gets noticed. Force makes people afraid. And fear makes people cautious. And cautious people start locking their doors, checking their windows, guarding their hearts. So instead, Lewis suggested, temptation prefers a much quieter method. It prefers to knock. It prefers to be invited in. In his imaginative writings, he pictured this dynamic through the eyes of a senior demon mentoring a younger one, and the advice given in that fictional correspondence was almost always the same in spirit, even when the specific tactic changed. Never announce yourself as evil. Never let the human see you coming. Dress the temptation up as something normal, something even good, something the person can justify with a perfectly reasonable sentence in their own head. That is the method. That is how the knock works. And once you understand that, you start to see it everywhere, in your own life, in your own week, maybe even in your own day-to-day. Think about how it actually happens in real life. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides, today I will destroy my integrity. Nobody sits down and thinks, today I will let bitterness take root in my heart until it strangles every relationship I have. That is not how it works. Instead, there is a knock, a small one, a thought that says, just this once, it will not matter. A feeling that says you deserve this after everything you have been through. A voice so reasonable sounding that says everybody does this, you're not even doing anything wrong. And because the knock is quiet, because it does not look like the enemy, the door gets opened, not out of malice, out of familiarity, out of exhaustion, out of the simple human tendency to assume that if something does not look dangerous, it probably is not. Lewis understood that this is precisely the miscalculation that undoes people, and it is worth sitting with that idea for a moment. Because if it is true, then the most important skill a person can develop is not the ability to fight obvious evil. It is the ability to recognize disguised evil before the door is even open. Here is where the story gets personal, because this is not just a concept from an old British writer. This is something happening in your life right now, today, in ways you may not have noticed yet. Picture the moment right before a compromise, not a dramatic one, a small one. The moment before you say the sentence that will hurt someone, but justify it to yourself as honesty. The moment before you look at the thing you know you should not look at, but tell yourself it is just curiosity. The moment before you let the resentment simmer instead of speaking the truth, because speaking the truth feels harder than staying quiet and cultivating a grudge. Every single one of those moments is a knock, and every single one of those moments feels, in the instant it happens, completely reasonable. That is the trap. That is the entire mechanism. If it felt evil, you would slam the door. It does not feel evil. It feels like a normal Tuesday. It feels like being human. And so you answer it, and you let it in, and you do not even notice the moment the door closed behind it. Lewis also wrote extensively about pride, and he considered it, in his own words, paraphrased here, to be not simply one sin among many, but something closer to the essential vice, the corruption from which nearly every other corruption grows. And what is fascinating, what should genuinely unsettle you if you think about it carefully, is how pride never knocks looking like pride. Nobody opens their door to a monster labeled arrogance. pride knocks disguised as confidence. It knocks disguised as standards. It knocks disguised as simply knowing your own worth, or refusing to let people walk over you, or having good taste, or being right when everyone else is wrong. It knocks wearing the exact language that our culture uses to praise people. And so you let it in, you feed it, you give it the best room in the house, and it grows, quietly, year after year, until one day you find yourself unable to apologize, unable to be corrected, unable to sit in a room with someone who disagrees with you without your whole body tensing in defense. And you never once felt the door open. That is how effective the disguise was. Now here is the turning point, the part of this story where everything shifts. Because up to now, this might sound like a warning designed only to make you afraid, to make you suspicious of every thought and every feeling, to turn you into someone who trusts nothing and no one, always bracing for the next disguised threat. But that is not where Lewis actually landed, and it is not where this video is going either. Because fear is not the answer to deception, discernment is. There is an enormous difference between a person who is anxious about every knock and a person who has simply learned to ask the right question before opening the door. And the right question is not complicated. It is not mystical. It does not require years of theological training. The question is simply this: does what is knocking ask me to become smaller, harder, more selfish, more afraid, more isolated from the people who love me? Or does it ask me to become someone capable of more love, more honesty, more courage, more patience than I currently have? That single question, asked honestly, in the actual moment of temptation, is powerful enough to expose almost every disguise the enemy has ever worn. Stay with this a little longer, because we are about to look at exactly how this plays out in the ordinary details of a life. The parts nobody puts in the highlight reel. And if you have felt your attention drifting even slightly, this next section is going to bring you right back, because it gets specific in a way that most people find uncomfortably accurate. Consider the knock of comparison. It arrives disguised as ambition, as motivation, as simply wanting to do well. You open your phone, you see someone else's success, someone else's body, someone else's family, someone else's life laid out in a square of curated light, and something knocks. It says, look how far behind you are. It says you should feel something about this. And so you let it in, and it sits down, and it starts whispering all evening, comparing your unfinished life to somebody else's finished highlight reel. And by the time you go to bed, you feel smaller than you did that morning, and you cannot even explain exactly why. That is the knock of comparison. And it rarely looks like envy when it arrives. It looks like simply paying attention to the world around you. Consider the knock of self-pity. It disguises itself as self-awareness, as finally being honest about how hard your life has been. And to be clear, pain is real, suffering is real, and naming it honestly matters. But there is a version of this knock that does not want you to name your pain and move through it. It wants you to move in with your pain permanently, to build your entire identity around what was done to you, to use your wound as an excuse for every unkindness you commit afterward. Lewis wrote often about how suffering can be either the material out of which a person builds something beautiful, or the material out of which a person builds a permanent monument to their own bitterness. And the difference is not the suffering itself. The difference is which knock you answer in response to it. Consider the knock of easy comfort, arriving in 100 small forms, all of them plausible, all of them reasonable on their own. One more hour of numbing distraction instead of the hard conversation you need to have. One more purchase to fill the emptiness instead of sitting with the emptiness long enough to understand it. One more scroll instead of one more prayer. One more excuse instead of one more honest look in the mirror. None of these knocks look dramatic. None of them look like the villain in a story. They look like relaxing. They look like self-care. They look like nothing at all, which is exactly why they are so effective. And exactly why so many people wake up one day, 10 years later, and cannot explain where all that time went, or why they feel further from the person they wanted to become instead of closer. There is another knock worth naming, the knock of self-justification, and it might be the most common one of all, because it almost never arrives before the wrong action. It arrives right after. You already said the cruel thing, you already cut the corner, you already looked away from someone who needed you, and now, immediately, a very persuasive voice knocks with an explanation ready-made. It says you were tired. It says they had it coming. It says anyone else would have done the same thing in your position. And here's what makes this knock so dangerous, more dangerous in some ways than the ones that come before the wrongdoing. This one does not ask you to do something wrong. It asks you to never feel the weight of what you already did. To build a comfortable little room around the action so it never has to be examined, apologized for, or corrected. Answer that knock enough times, and you end up with a person who has done 100 small, unkind things across a lifetime and genuinely, sincerely believes they have done almost nothing wrong at all. Because every single one of those 100 moments had its own perfectly reasonable explanation waiting at the door. Lewis had a phrase for the overall shape of this kind of life, and it is worth sitting with because of how ordinary it sounds. He described the safest road to hell, in his own words paraphrased here, as the gradual one, the gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without milestones, without signposts warning you of danger. Notice what is missing from that description. No cliff edge, no dramatic fall, no single catastrophic decision that a person could point back to and say, that was the moment everything went wrong. Just a slope, just a long, comfortable, barely noticeable decline, one quiet knock answered after another, each one so small on its own that objecting to it would feel dramatic, even neurotic. Nobody trips and falls into becoming a person they do not recognize. They stroll into it, calmly, one reasonable little door opened after another, for years, until one day they look in the mirror and do not know how they got there. That is not a comfortable thought. It is not meant to be. But it is far more useful than a comfortable thought would be, because at least it tells you where to actually put your attention. Not on the one dramatic temptation you are terrified of facing someday, on the small, boring, forgettable one sitting at your door right now. There is a picture Lewis created in one of his most loved stories of a boy who becomes, quite literally, a dragon after nights spent lying awake thinking greedy, dragonish thoughts, until he wakes one morning and finds his own selfishness has taken physical shape all over his body. And the boy, horrified at what he has become, tries desperately to claw the dragon skin off himself, scratching and tearing at his own scales, layer after layer, only to find fresh dragon scales underneath every single time, no matter how hard he works at it. No matter how much effort or willpower he throws at the problem. He cannot undo it by his own strength. He can only lie there, exhausted, and let something other than himself, something far stronger, tear the layers away in a single act he could never have managed alone. It is a strange and almost uncomfortable image, and Lewis meant it to be, because most people, when they finally notice the dragon scales forming on their own character, respond exactly the way that boy first responded. They try to fix themselves through pure effort, more discipline, more willpower, one more self-improvement plan, and they claw and find new scales underneath every single layer they remove. Not because effort is worthless, but because some transformations were never designed to be done alone, no matter how hard the clawing. There is one more knock worth naming before we move forward, and it might be the quietest of all, which is exactly why it works so well. It is the knock of isolation. It rarely arrives shouting, "Get away from everyone who loves you." It arrives whispering something much gentler, something almost sensible. It says, "You do not need to explain this to anyone." It says they would not understand anyway. It says, "Just handle this one on your own for now. You can talk about it later, when things are calmer, when you have it more figured out." And so a person quietly stops mentioning the struggle to the friend who would have noticed something was wrong. Quietly stops answering the calls from the family member who always asks too many honest questions. Quietly builds a smaller and smaller circle, not out of any dramatic decision to cut people off, but simply by answering, again and again, a knock that always sounds reasonable in the moment. Lewis understood, and wrote about repeatedly, that isolation is not usually the goal itself. It is the setup. A person surrounded by others who know them well is much harder to deceive, because someone else usually notices the dragon scales forming long before the person growing them does. Cut that person off, quietly, one reasonable excuse at a time, and suddenly there is no one left in the room to say, "Something seems different about you lately. Are you all right?" That silence is not peace. It is just an empty room where an honest voice used to be. Now, If at this point you're starting to feel a little exposed, a little too seen, stay with it, because this is exactly the moment most people want to look away. And it is exactly the moment you need to keep watching, because the next part changes everything you have heard so far. Here's the turn. Here is the thing Lewis understood that most modern conversations about self-improvement completely miss. You cannot simply decide through sheer willpower to stop answering the wrong knocks. Willpower is not strong enough, not consistently, not over a whole lifetime. If it were, nobody who ever tried hard would ever fail, and yet the strongest, most disciplined, most well-intentioned people fail at this constantly. What Lewis proposed instead, again and again across his writing, was something both simpler and far more demanding. Character is not built primarily in the big dramatic moments. It is built in the 10,000 tiny moments nobody sees. The small knocks answered correctly, when no one is watching and no reward is coming. Every time you choose the harder, honest thing over the easier, convenient lie, even in something as small as how you speak to a stranger who cannot help you, or a family member who will never notice, you are either becoming, in his words paraphrased, a little more like a certain kind of creature, or a little more like another. There is no neutral ground. Every knock answered shapes you, whether you notice it or not, whether anyone else notices it or not. This is the part where the video could easily end, with a tidy little lesson: be careful what you let in, examine your motives, stay alert. But that would leave out the single most important thing Lewis actually believed. The thing that makes this entire warning bearable instead of crushing. Because if all of this were simply a lifelong battle you had to win alone, through your own vigilance, checking every single knock with perfect discernment for the rest of your life, you would fail. Everyone would fail. The standard is too high and human attention is too limited, and the disguises are too good. Lewis did not believe the answer was a more exhausting kind of self-policing. He believed the answer was a relationship, a source of strength outside yourself, because he was convinced that no person examines their own heart with full honesty by sheer effort of will. People need something or someone capable of seeing what they cannot see in themselves and gently, patiently, showing them the door they left open without shame, without condemnation, simply so it could be closed and something better invited in instead. And this is where the title of this video finally makes complete sense, because there is one knock that reverses the entire pattern we have been describing. Almost every dangerous knock this video has described arrives quietly, disguised, unannounced, asking to be let in without examination. But there is a different kind of knock. One Lewis referenced by pointing back to much older words, an image of someone standing at a door, knocking, not sneaking in, not disguising themselves, but simply waiting to be noticed and freely invited. The difference between that knock and every other knock in this video is night and day. This one does not pretend to be your friend while planning to take something from you. This one does not disguise itself as comfort while quietly stealing your character. This one stands in plain sight and waits patiently for as long as it takes, respecting the fact that the door can only be opened from the inside, never forced from the outside. There is a simple, almost embarrassingly ordinary practice that grows directly out of everything Lewis believed about small daily choices shaping a life, and it costs nothing, takes only a few minutes, and requires no special training. At the end of each day, before sleep, sit quietly and simply walk back through the hours. Not to punish yourself, not to spiral into guilt, but simply to notice: where did a knock come today, and what did I do with it? Was there a moment I felt the pull toward comparison, toward self-pity, toward numbing distraction, toward a small, unkind word dressed up as honesty? Did I answer it? Did I let it in without even noticing? And just as importantly, where did I get it right? Where did I choose the harder, honest thing over the easier, convenient one, even when nobody was watching and nothing was on the line? This kind of quiet, daily review sounds almost too small to matter. And that is exactly the point, because everything in this video has been about how transformation in either direction almost never happens through one dramatic moment. It happens through thousands of small ones, noticed or unnoticed, examined or ignored. A person who spends 5 honest minutes doing this every night for a year will know their own door and their own patterns and their own weaknesses far better than a person who never once stops to look. And knowing the door is the first step toward finally being able to choose, deliberately, instead of simply drifting, which knock gets answered, and which one gets left standing outside in the cold, unanswered, until it eventually gives up and leaves. So here is the actual warning. Underneath the warning, the thing this whole video has been building toward. Do not answer the next knock, the quiet one, the reasonable one, the one that flatters you or comforts you or tells you that just this once will not matter, without first asking what it is actually asking of you and what it will actually cost you. Slow down before you open that door. Ask the honest question. Does this make me more loving or more hollow? Does this make me more courageous or more numb? Does this bring me closer to the people I love? Or does it quietly wall me off from them one small secret at a time? That single habit, repeated daily, in the smallest moments, is what Lewis believed separated a life that slowly hardens into something unrecognizable from a life that slowly becomes, in his words paraphrased, more fully and beautifully itself than it ever could have imagined on its own. But there is a second knock worth answering. The one that has been waiting patiently this whole time. The one that does not trick you or rush you or disguise itself as something small. That knock is still there. It has been there the entire length of this video, the entire length of your week, maybe the entire length of your life, and it has never once forced its way in because it was never that kind of guest. If everything in this video has felt uncomfortably familiar, if you have recognized your own door standing open to things that have been quietly taken from you for years, then maybe tonight is not the night to answer another quiet knock. Maybe tonight is the night to finally answer the one that has been waiting the longest. If this was the video that finally put language to something you have felt for a long time, but never quite named, do not let this be another one of those things you watch and forget by tomorrow. Sit with it. Talk about it with someone tonight. And if you want to go deeper into the ideas Lewis actually wrote about, his own books are the place to start. In his own words, not a summary, not a paraphrase, the real thing. Subscribe if you want more of this, because there is another knock coming next week, and I promise you, it is one you will want to hear about before it arrives at your own door.